Beer before civilization. It sounds incredible, but it might just be true. Join us as we dive into the incredible history of the world's most ancient drink.
London, 1854. On Broad Street in the Soho district, people are dying by the dozens every day. Cholera. The bodies can't be removed fast enough. The stench is so overwhelming that people in the neighbouring streets block their windows with cloth. Physician John Snow goes from house to house, asking every surviving family the same question. What did you drink? The answer he hears again and again doesn't fit any existing theory of disease. The people who drank water from the local public pump died. The people who drank beer from the nearby pub survived. Every single one of them. This was not a coincidence, and it was not an exception. For most of human history, water was deadly. Rivers and wells in every city were contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and everything else people threw into them. Cholera, typhoid fever, and dysentery all spread through water. People who drank the water became sick and died. People who drank beer survived. Because during the brewing process, beer is boiled, and everything living in the water is killed. The alcohol finishes off whatever remains. This means that for thousands of years, long before anyone understood why, beer was not a beverage. Beer was medicine. It was the only relatively safe liquid that an ordinary city dweller could drink without risking death by the next morning. Medieval physicians prescribed it to newborn babies, to pregnant women, to the sick and the dying. Monasteries brewed it for pilgrims as the first remedy for exhaustion and dehydration. English sailors received a gallon of beer every day as part of their official naval ration, because the water stored in barrels turned into a breeding ground for disease within a few weeks, while beer remained safe to drink. But the story of beer does not begin in medieval London, and it does not begin aboard a ship. It begins 5,000 years earlier, in the place where people first realized they had accidentally discovered something that would change everything. Ancient Sumer, in what is now modern-day Iraq, around 3000 BC. The earliest known written recipe in human history is not a recipe for bread. It is not a recipe for medicine, and it is not a military manual. It is a recipe for beer. The hymn to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of brewing, contains a detailed step-by-step description of how to brew beer from bread and grain. It was inscribed on a clay tablet around 1800 BC, but the brewing tradition it describes had already existed for nearly 1,000 years by then. In Sumer, beer was not a luxury, and it was not entertainment. It was currency. Workers received it as part of their wages, strictly rationed and carefully recorded in official state records. The amount of beer depended on a person's rank and status. An ordinary labourer received 1 ration, a supervisor received 2, an official received 3. It was a rigid hierarchy of power measured in litres of barley beer. In Egypt, the system was even larger. The workers who built the pyramids, and archaeology confirms this, it is not a legend, received about 4 litres of beer a day as part of their official state ration, along with bread, onions, and garlic. Thousands of people worked on the construction of the pyramids at Giza, and the Egyptian state operated enormous breweries right next to the construction site. Beer was the literal fuel that powered the building of the most famous monuments of the ancient world. The Egyptians placed beer in tombs alongside other valuable possessions so that the dead would not suffer from thirst in the afterlife. They decorated tomb walls with scenes of brewing because they considered it an activity worthy of being remembered for eternity. The goddess Hathor was regarded as the patron of beer, and her festivals were marked by large-scale drinking, not simply as entertainment, but as a religious act. In both Sumer and Egypt, brewing was almost entirely women's work. Not because men objected to it, but because beer was brewed in the same place where food was prepared, the household. which was traditionally the domain of women. Women knew the recipes, passed them down to their daughters, ran beer shops, and achieved a degree of economic independence through that knowledge. This continued for thousands of years, until something happened that changed everything. And we'll come back to that later, because that story is much darker than it first appears. Medieval Europe inherited the tradition of home brewing directly from the ancient world. In every household where there was a woman, there was a brewery. Not a factory, not a workshop, just a kettle, grain, water, and knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. Women who brewed beer were known as alewives, and it was a respected profession that provided a stable income. But the greatest centres of brewing in medieval Europe were the monasteries. And here is an important detail that is often overlooked. The earliest monastic breweries were run by women. Nuns brewed beer for pilgrims, for the sick in monastery hospitals, and for themselves during periods of fasting, when solid food was forbidden, but liquids were allowed. The medieval church did not officially prohibit beer during Lent, considering it a drink rather than food. During the 40 days of fasting, monks and nuns could consume up to 5 litres of beer a day. It was their primary source of calories and nutrition. They called it liquid bread. It was in the monasteries of medieval Europe that brewing evolved from an ordinary household activity into a science. Monks and nuns experimented with recipes, recorded their results, and studied which herbs produced the best flavour and the longest shelf life. It was also in the monasteries around the 9th century that hops began to be used systematically. Before that, beer was flavoured with a mixture of herbs known as gruit, which included bog myrtle, yarrow, and various other plants. Hops proved superior in almost every way. They produced a better flavour, preserved the beer more effectively, and greatly extended its shelf life. The transition from gruit to hops took several centuries and spread largely through the monastic tradition of experimentation and careful record-keeping. Monastic beer became the finest beer in Europe. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of kilometres not only to visit holy sites, but also to reach monasteries famous for their beer. In German monasteries, monks developed the technique of cold fermentation in deep stone cellars. That technique became the foundation of lager beer, which today accounts for around 90% of the global beer market. Some monastic breweries still exist today. The Trappist abbeys of Belgium continue to brew beer according to traditions that are more than 700 years old, and their products are considered among the finest in the world. Westvleteren 12, brewed at the Abbey of St. Sixtus in Belgium, regularly tops international rankings of the world's best beers. Yet the only way to buy a bottle is to travel to the monastery in person, call ahead using a special reservation line, and receive permission to purchase it. To this day, the monks brew only as much beer as they need to support the monastery, not a single litre more. But beyond the monastery walls, something else was beginning to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the course of 2 or 3 centuries. And by the 15th century, the world of brewing had been transformed beyond recognition. This is one of the darkest and least talked about turning points in the history of beer. And it begins not with brewing, but with money. By the 13th and 14th centuries, beer in the cities of Northern Europe had evolved from a homemade product into a major commercial commodity. Cities were growing, populations were increasing, and demand for beer was growing right along with them. Brewing was no longer simply part of household life, it had become a business. And wherever serious money appeared, there were always people who wanted to control it. City authorities began introducing brewing licenses. Brewers' guilds started to form and required formal membership. Brewing equipment became larger and more expensive. Large copper kettles, storage buildings, and horses for transportation. All of this required capital. And women in medieval European society had extremely limited access to capital, credit, and official guild membership. Not because they didn't know how to brew beer, but because the system itself was structured in a way that prevented them from participating in the growing commercial industry on equal terms. But that was only economics. Then something far worse was added. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was swept by the witch hunts. And this is where an interesting detail appears, one that historians have only begun to point out relatively recently. The descriptions of witches in texts from that period are strikingly similar to the descriptions of a typical alewife, a woman who brewed and sold beer. The pointed hat worn by women selling beer in the marketplace so customers could spot them from a distance. The cat that lived in every household where grain was stored, protecting it from mice. The broom used to sweep the brewery floor. The large black brewing kettle. These all became the classic attributes of a witch, and every one of them came from the everyday life of a woman brewer. Historians do not claim a direct cause and effect relationship, but the parallels are too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. A woman brewing something in a large kettle, surrounded by herbs, with a cat and a broom, became a suspicious figure in an age of growing religious panic. Accusations of witchcraft fell disproportionately on women working in traditional female occupations, including brewing, folk medicine, and midwifery. By the 17th century, brewing had become a male profession in most European cities. Women were never officially banned from brewing. They were simply pushed out through a combination of economic pressure, legal restrictions, and social fear. Knowledge that had been passed from mother to daughter for thousands of years was transferred into the hands of male guilds, monasteries, and commercial breweries. And it is at this point in the history of beer that a law appears, one that would change brewing forever. The year is 1516. Duke Wilhelm IV of Bavaria issues a decree that will go down in history as the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law. The text is remarkably brief. Beer brewed in Bavaria may contain only 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. Everything else is forbidden. At first glance, it sounds like a law designed to protect quality. In reality, it was driven by politics and economics. First, banning wheat from beer production reserved it for bread making, which, during years of recurring famine, was a matter of state stability. Second, barley was grown on lands owned by the Duke's political allies, so the law helped protect their incomes. Third, banning other ingredients placed brewers from neighbouring regions at a disadvantage, since many of them relied on cheaper ingredients that allowed them to sell their beer at lower prices. It was a protectionist trade law wrapped in the language of quality, but it had an unexpected long-term effect. Bavarian beer, brewed according to a strict standard, really did become more consistent and more predictable in quality than beer from many other regions. Its reputation grew. When Germany was unified in the 19th century, Bavaria insisted that the Reinheitsgebot be extended to the entire country as one of the conditions for joining the Union. The law remained in force in one form or another until 1987, when the European Court of Justice ruled that it violated the principles of free trade. Today, German brewers are legally allowed to add almost anything they want to their beer. Most traditional breweries still choose not to, not because they have to, but because 500 years of the law have become part of their cultural identity. The Reinheitsgebot is now far more of a marketing advantage than a legal restriction. While Germany was building its brewing identity around a strict purity law, Britain faced a problem in the 18th century that no law could solve. How do you get beer to India? British soldiers and colonial officials in India faced the same problem that city dwellers had faced throughout history. The local water could kill them. Beer was a necessity. But the voyage from Britain to India, around the Cape of Good Hope and through the heat of the tropics, took several months. Ordinary beer spoiled long before it reached its destination. Several attempts to solve the problem failed. Then, a London brewer named George Hodgson came up with a simple solution. Hops and alcohol act as natural preservatives. So why not brew a beer with as much hops and as much alcohol as possible? It would survive the journey. In the 1790s, Hodgson began brewing exactly that kind of beer. After months of rolling in the hold of a ship, it arrived in India not only intact, but actually improved. The long sea voyage, constant movement, and changing temperatures transformed the beer, giving it a rich, layered flavour that fresh beer simply didn't have. The British troops stationed in India loved it. India Pale Ale, or IPA, quickly became one of the most popular styles of beer across the British Empire. When shipping routes changed in the 19th century, and beer no longer spent months at sea, brewers learned to recreate that distinctive flavour by other means. Today, IPA is one of the most popular styles in the world of craft beer. American craft brewers have pushed the concept even further, creating double IPAs and triple IPAs, with so much hops that the first sip can be as bitter as medicine. What began as a logistical solution for supplying a colonial army became a flavour enjoyed by millions of people who have never set foot in either India or aboard a sailing ship. The 19th century did to beer what the Industrial Revolution did to almost everything else. It transformed it from a local craft into a global commodity. And two inventions played a decisive role in that transformation. The first was the research of Louis Pasteur. In 1876, he published his groundbreaking work on beer fermentation, explaining the role of yeast and demonstrating how the brewing process could be controlled to produce a consistent, predictable result every single time. Before Pasteur, every batch of beer was a gamble. One might turn out excellent, while the next would spoil for reasons no one could explain. After Pasteur, brewers finally had a level of control they had never possessed before. The second breakthrough was mechanical refrigeration. Before the invention of the refrigerator, pale lager beer could only be brewed during the winter and stored in cold underground cellars, because lager yeast requires low temperatures to ferment properly. With the arrival of mechanical refrigeration in the 1870s and 1880s, lager could be brewed all year round in virtually any climate. That breakthrough opened the door to industrial-scale beer production on a scale that had never before been possible. American brewers, many of them German immigrants, were quick to take advantage of these new technologies. Companies like Anheuser-Busch and Pabst began producing light, pale lager on an industrial scale, distributing it by railroad across thousands of miles. By the end of the 19th century, a handful of large breweries controlled a market that had once been divided among thousands of small local producers. Thousands of years of regional brewing diversity began to disappear. Beer was becoming the same everywhere, and then came a man who wanted to ban it altogether. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect in January 1920. The production, transportation, and sale of alcohol in the United States were declared illegal. Supporters of prohibition, the temperance movement, which had spent decades lobbying for the ban, believed that within a few years, America would forget what drunkenness even looked like. Breweries closed, bars shut down. Newspapers predicted that manufacturers of coffins and prison cells would soon be out of business, because crime and alcohol-related deaths were expected to decline dramatically. The exact opposite happened. Illegal breweries sprang up across the country like mushrooms after the rain. Underground bars, speakeasies, operated in every major city, often with the quiet approval of local police, who were simply paid to look the other way. Organised crime took control of alcohol production and distribution, growing from small street gangs into powerful criminal enterprises worth billions of dollars. Al Capone in Chicago, Lucky Luciano in New York. Prohibition created them just as surely as it created the demand for their services. But something else happened as well. While commercial breweries stood silent, Americans began brewing beer at home. Home brewing was technically illegal, but in most cases the authorities looked the other way. During the 13 years of Prohibition, millions of Americans learned how to brew their own beer. They experimented with recipes, shared techniques, and passed their knowledge on to friends and neighbors. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, the United States had a thriving homebrewing culture that simply hadn't existed before the ban. It was this culture that, half a century later, would give birth to the movement that changed the global beer industry forever. By the 1970s, the American beer market had been almost completely divided among a handful of giant corporations producing light pale lager that tasted virtually the same from coast to coast. It was safe, consistent, predictable, and almost completely devoid of character. Several generations of Americans grew up believing that this was simply what beer was supposed to be: pale yellow, light-bodied, and lacking any distinctive flavour. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed a law legalizing home brewing. It seemed like a minor bureaucratic decision, one that attracted little public attention. Its consequences turned out to be revolutionary. Thousands of people across the country who had been brewing beer at home as a hobby were finally able to do it openly and exchange recipes without risking breaking the law. Home brewing clubs began appearing everywhere. People discovered British ales, German wheat beers, Belgian Trappist ales, all the diversity that industrial brewing had erased over the previous century, and some of them decided to open small commercial breweries. The first craft breweries appeared in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. Their founders brewed beer with character, bitter, dark, rich, and full of aroma. The very kind of beer that monks and alewives had brewed for 1,000 years before the Industrial Revolution replaced it with pale uniformity. The major brewing corporations laughed. Industry experts predicted they would fail. The market decided otherwise. Today there are more than 9,000 craft breweries operating in the United States, more than at any other time in the country's history, including the years before Prohibition. Craft beer now accounts for roughly a quarter of the American beer market by value. The craft beer revolution spread far beyond the United States, reaching Europe, Australia, Japan, and Latin America. A beer culture that once seemed destined for endless uniformity proved itself capable of an extraordinary renaissance. John Snow, standing on Broad Street in 1854, wasn't thinking about the history of beer. He was trying to understand why some people were dying while others survived. The answer, he discovered, that beer was safer than water, was something humanity had known through experience for 5,000 years. It simply had never been able to explain why. The Sumerian scribe carving a beer recipe into a clay tablet had no idea that he was creating the oldest surviving written recipe in human history, or that 5,000 years later it would be studied by history students around the world. The Egyptian official recording the beer rations of the pyramid builders never imagined that his records would outlive the pharaohs themselves. The medieval nun adding hops to a brewing kettle did not know that she was changing the flavour of beer for the next 1,000 years. The woman brewer, who lost her profession in the 15th century, had no way of knowing that 600 years later, she would, in a sense, be replaced by the craft beer revolution, which would return brewing to where it had begun, to people making beer with their own hands, using their own recipes. George Hodgson, who created IPA so that beer would not spoil in the hold of a ship, never imagined that he was inventing a style that would become the symbol of an entire movement in the 21st century. And Jimmy Carter, when he signed the law legalizing homebrewing, thought he was approving a minor bureaucratic reform, not setting a revolution in motion. Beer survived bans, wars, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of corporate uniformity. It survived the witch hunts and prohibition. It outlasted everyone who tried to control it, standardize it, or ban it altogether. Today, the global beer market is worth roughly $800 billion a year. Around 2 billion hectolitres of beer are consumed worldwide every year, a number no Sumerian scribe recording workers' rations on a clay tablet could ever have imagined. China, a country with a tea culture stretching back thousands of years, is now the world's largest beer consumer by total volume. Mexico is the world's largest beer exporter. Corona, brewed in Mexico City, is sold in more than 180 countries and has become one of the most recognizable beer brands on the planet. But the most remarkable part is not the scale. It is the fact that a Trappist monk in a Belgian abbey and a homebrewer in a garage in Portland are, in essence, doing the very same thing that a medieval alewife did in her home, and that a nun did in a monastery cellar. They take water, grain, and hops. They wait. And they create the one drink that for most of human history was safer than water. The same drink that helped save the people of Broad Street in 1854 while their neighbours were dying of cholera. The same drink that began as a ration and became a culture. Not bad for fermented water and grain. For a drink humanity has been making for 5,000 years, and one that throughout all that time no one has ever managed to ban, standardize, or stop.